Hey, Chris and Tom, thank you for coming in today. This is a remarkable opportunity. You're doing amazing work. You've done record-breaking sort of proof points at different aspects of quantum science and technology. So, particularly in quantum computing, I think it's really, really interesting. And thank you for coming in and sharing your insights and your excitement and passion with our audience.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So first of all, and I'll start with you, Chris, then go to Tom. If you can maybe describe one or two or maybe three inflection points that created this marvelous career and person you are today. And it could be when you were 5 and you saw some kind of insect and you were curious, or it could have been something from your family or when you were in university. Just anything that you thought were just big transition points in your life. So, and by the way, because I track this, my audience is typically CEOs and investors, and then next to that are professors and engineers. So that's usually my audience, and then last would be students. So,
well, definitely, I think my first inflection point was when I was probably about 4 or 5, and my father found the most effective way of stopping me taking apart all the different toys in the house and hiding the pieces I couldn't work out where they went under my bed. Was to bring me home a big bag of old car radios from a scrap heap near where he worked. So I could sit out on my bedroom floor play with my screwdrivers and take these all apart and try and work out how these went together. And that really taught me that, with a screwdriver and determination, you really can take anything apart and understand how it works. And then with quite a lot more skill, you can put it back together and have it still work afterwards, almost the same. And then after that, the next inflection point was, I think, when I was at university, and I realized that this whole physics thing is pretty cool, but a lot of it's worked out and works really well. And there's very few frontiers left in the world. And for me, quantum is one of them, where we don't have it all worked out. We have a pretty good theory. We have pretty good ideas how the next generation of things in the world are going to be impacted by being able to control these quantum systems. But it really is open season on building these things out, and very few people have all the ideas, and that really excites me, since I like the underpinning theory behind how cool stuff works, but I also really like doing something with my hands and building something. And then I think the third inflection point, a while after this journey, after I realized just how hard it is, probably 5 years, 6 years or so later, is when we first set the world record for entangling gates. This is Tom and I during our PhDs in the lab, where we went from seeing the world record as being a pinnacle that if we tried really hard in the lab, we might get close to realizing we are very comfortably exceeding the world record. And we're setting the standards rather than just trying to reach them.
That's really interesting. There's sort of this curiosity of your father taking bits and pieces and you're sort of taking things apart. I share that as well when I was really, really young. And then your interest in physics, and that leading to interest in all of the sort of quantum phenomena that's out there. That's really interesting. And then that leading into, quantum computing and breaking records, right? So, and working with your partner, Tom. And so that's an interesting combination between the two of you. Okay, Tom, your inflection points.
So, my background's similar to Chris's, but a little bit different. So particularly, I guess I class myself as a reformed philosopher. So I did my undergraduate in the philosophy of physics. And what I was really interested in was the kind of conceptual foundations of science, and particularly quantum mechanics. And this was really, really cool stuff. But by the end of it, I was kind of getting to the point where I thought, I think I want to do something where I'm actually just like a little bit more hands-on. So I saw this great opportunity in quantum computing in untrapped ions, and I really went for it. And then there's this great bit at the start of my PhD where suddenly you're in this room full of equipment, and you're doing electronics, you're playing with lasers, you're doing a little bit of plumbing, just kind of a bit of everything. And you realize there's this just total frontier in technology where there's this opportunity to build really impactful devices, which are kind of unlike anything that anyone's ever done. And it's kind of particularly special because it's sort of the most complex kind of thing you can do, where like one person or a couple of people can kind of build up and understand this whole room full of equipment and really make something unique. It's not like CERN where it's thousands and thousands of people and everyone understands one little bit. You can really get a grasp of this and understand it. And that was fantastic. So as Chris said, I spent my PhD, a lot of it working close with Chris. We built up this technology. We really, really got things working nicely. We say for these very small systems, actually, we've kind of got the technology here really working, and now we need to scale it. And that's then when, Ionics is the next inflection point coming in and saying, okay, let's now actually take this stuff and really build it into a useful technology. And that's where the company comes from.
So, Tom, I find this fascinating. You're really interested in the philosophy behind physics. Does that mean that you really investigated areas like consciousness and physics and things like that, like really outlier topics? And then, of course, you migrated into this really interest in, quantum information science and technology, and then the practicality aspects of it, where you're actually building these quantum bits and so on. And as I mentioned before with Chris, you're breaking records and so forth. But I'm curious about the philosophy part of it.
That's interesting. So I think when I say philosophy of physics, I mean something which is like a lot like what Newton would have called like natural science, or what Einstein was thinking about. What I was really interested in was like the foundations of physics. So, nice examples here are like, quantum mechanics says we have this beautiful theory that describes the world in terms of, these waves and superposition entanglement until you look at it. But until you look at it and then something else happens, that's not really how physics is supposed to work. So how do we reconcile this? And this is this kind of problem you have whenever you start trying to explain how quantum computing works, that we call the measurement problem. Another nice example is, statistical mechanics. We have this fantastic theory that describes everything from like why eggs break but they don't unbreak through to what happens in black holes. But there's no really good understanding of like, how this theory that's so universal and powerful, how it then relates to the actual microphysics. It's like a total gap we can't really bridge. And these are really, interesting kind of foundational questions.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I had a dinner. In fact, I spoke a few times with Roger Penrose, and in fact, yeah, and in fact, I moderated a keynote that he did for AI for Good, this conference I founded with the ITU UN agency, and then we opened a conference that were the two opening keynotes, and then I had dinner with him, and his ideas about every aspect of physics, but also astronomy, was really fascinating, and sort of the reasons behind things, or his view of the reasons behind things. So, but it'd be interesting to get into both of your backstories a little bit more. But we got to move onto the quantum science part of this thing. So let's talk about what are some of the foundational areas now that you're seeing in quantum science, quantum information science and technology, and why you think that what you're doing on the ion side is really an area where you're spending a lot of time, and where you think maybe that's the winner or maybe not the winner. So and I'll go to Chris first, and then Tom, if you can make some comments. And that is, what do you see as the landscape of all the different sort of competing technologies that are out there? And I should mention, I did an interview with a group out of India, and they're working with pristine graphene, and they got room temperature, sort of some quantum effects, and then they're working on superposition and entanglement and so on. And I think that maybe this is something that could scale more easily, and because they're saying that error is not so much an issue with what they're working on, this error correction sort of area and the noise. So, but there's so much work being done. Lawrence Livermore laboratories and some of the other ones that are out there in the US, and quantum, topological quantum computing. I mean, the semiconductor side. So I'd like to get your viewpoint on what you see as the landscape and why you think yours is positioned so well. And maybe what I'll do is I'll get Chris, you can describe the landscape, and then Tom, you can describe why you think you're positioned so well.
Deal. So the landscape, what I'd say is we're at this really exciting phase now where we're at the end of the beginning. Now we now know roughly how the chessboard is laid out, what everyone has to work with, and where everyone's struggles are going to be to get there. And then one has to choose one's poison, like in any technology. Nothing's ever perfect, but there are some kinds of problems you can see your way through, and some kind of problems that look more existentially scary. And what I really say about quantum computing is that 20 years ago, it all looked impossibly hard. And there was a big question about, is this ever going to be possible? And then over the last, 10 years after that, it got to the point where it was probably possible, but it was very ambiguous as to whether it was going to be practical. And we're now at the phase where we can properly make, power, size, timeline, cost assumptions and really start doing the engineering. So yeah, I'd say the really pivotal moment, for both of us was maybe 5-6 years ago, when we went from saying there's very clearly some hard, difficult performance targets you need to meet until this stuff starts becoming practical, until, for example, you can even start being able to do error correction. No one had shown quantum devices could be operated at the performance level where you could even have them start correcting their own errors and bootstrap up. And for us, crossing this point where we demonstrated for the first time in small ion trap devices that we could get the performance levels up to the point where you could start doing error correction. Just getting that existence proof in, that to me is really exciting. So I think across the whole landscape, we're now at the point where we can start doing engineering rather than science. Science is about, is it possible? And we're past that. We know it's possible. And now we're starting to do the fun engineering about how do you make trade-offs in this very complex landscape? How do you choose which problems you want to tackle? And, we're biased on this, but we think ions are in a nice place where we're now properly into solving hard, scary hard, but still hard engineering problems where we can scope them properly. I'll let Tom say why.
So, the big thing you need when you want to build a quantum computer is a system which, behaves nicely quantum mechanically, right? So in particular, what you need is something where you can do quantum gates with really, really low errors. So when you look around the landscape of different technologies and say, okay, what's the one that's got the lowest errors? This has kind of always really been the trapped ions. And, this is kind of what you might expect, really, because atoms and ions, these are where quantum physics was largely discovered. And it's because they're so well isolated. You take a single atom, you put it in a vacuum with nothing else around it. It's about as close as you're ever going to get to a perfect quantum system. So from this side, they're really perfect. The challenge with them has always been, how do you build a technology out of single atoms that you can really scale? So for quite a long time, people have known, okay, they've got these great errors, let's try and scale them up. So what you do is you take a chip and you build something called an ion trap, which lets you hold a small number of single atoms, just tens of microns above the surface of that chip. And that's fantastic because the chip itself looks like a piece of silicon. It's something we know how to scale really, really well. The challenge is when you want to come and start doing quantum operations with these ions. Now you do that by shining lasers over the surface of the chip. And this becomes really, really challenging from a scalability point of view, because you start having to integrate a kind of optical photonic technology into a silicon chip that's sort of a magnitude that no one's really ever done before. And this becomes a very, very hard integration challenge. So what we do is we take these difficult lasers and we replace them with essentially microwave electronics. And using that, we can control our ion qubits using essentially microwave antennas which we can build into a pretty boring silicon chip. And this lets you get this really nice intersection of the kinds of technology which people know how to scale really, really well, as married with the one technology which really has this very, very good performance. And this gives you a kind of unique package where you can say, okay, this is something we can build up and will actually give us the technical performance we need.
Yeah, and what's really important about this is when you do proper engineering, you think a lot about system integration, and this allows us this separation, right? You have the quantum bit, these ions, individual single atoms, they can't go wrong, right? An individual atom is guaranteed to be perfect the universe over. And then you connect this to a chip and lock it above a chip, and that chip is purely classical. And really, when you take this to a foundry, it's very mundane to build. And this separation, this interface between the classical and the quantum, we think is quite unique to these ion trap systems, of being able to connect them tightly to a chip where you can scale out your silicon chip and expect your qubits to scale out with them. But at the same time as having the quantum bit being completely separate from the classical bit, so you're not making quantum chips, your chips are classical and can run at any temperature, and it doesn't affect the quality of your qubits.
There's computing technologies though, right? Like Xanadu just got, I believe, a 40 million injection from the Canadian government. They went unicorn in their funding. The Deep Tech Fund, which is a Canadian government fund, did one of the first investments, I think in 2019. And then in 2022, they went unicorn. They went over $1 billion in valuation. And then Canadian government independently put another 40 million. Where are you in this funding sort of cycle? I know the founder of AIM was sort of instituted or triggered your your interest, right, into doing a startup. So where are you in that funding story? And either of you can answer that.
Yeah, so we've just closed our Series A of about £30 million. And yeah, and one of the participants in this round was Herman Hauser, the founder of Arm. And in fact, he's one of the reasons the company exists in the first place. So I was sat next to him at a dinner at the Royal Society in the UK, in London, back a couple of years before Oxford Ionics was funded, having just given a talk on quantum computing and the great potential of this technology, when Herman sat down next to me at dinner and said, so, is this technology as good as you say it is? And, obviously I answered in the affirmative. And he said, well, when are you going to start a company to do it then? So I can invest in a semi-joking way. And that, after a few years, led to the germination of Oxford Ionics.
And then, and this to Tom, you got so many companies now producing things that people can try, right? A lot of it cloud-based, like IBM, right? They're making this available through the cloud, and they're scaling their technology. And so, what's your roadmap in terms of scaling yours, where you have some kind of indication of this ability that showing the promise of your ion trap technology?
Yes, that's right. So we have devices with cloud interface now, and we're starting to roll those out to selected partners over the course of this year for specific projects we're looking at. But I think the really interesting kind of question here is, like, as you said, what's the roadmap to get into useful devices, right? So what we know is that the first kind of time you can start to solve problems which really move the needle, the companies people want to pay for, these kick in when you have something which has the power of something like a few hundred perfect qubits, right? So the real question is, how are you going to get there? So a lot of what we're doing right now is really focused on, that end goal and winning the race rather than just kind of building small incremental devices. So what we know is that you can get there in the pretty near term if you have sufficiently low error rates that you're not relying on very, very heavy error correction, and you have devices that can support those numbers of qubits. So really most of our roadmap right now is on demonstrating those things.
And then tackling practical problems, right? So there's niche problems that different quantum companies and groups are tackling now. And just to show that maybe you still don't get the performance scaling that is sort of the promise of quantum computing, but they want to show that it can be done. And are you in that sort of area right now, or is that still to come, let's say next year or sometime this year? And can you give me maybe some specific examples?
Yeah, so perhaps I'll take that one. To us, the really exciting part is when the market starts switching on, right? And the market starts switching on when you can start solving problems that you can't solve any other way. And it's not even close. And yeah, that, as Tom said, happens in our analysis at the 100, 200 really good qubit regime. And just to give an idea of where the market is right now, the best systems that can be built are slightly better than 10 good qubits, but far, far less than 20 good qubits. So at that point, you're really in the shallows of quantum computing. You can't outperform an iPhone. And you learn a lot by playing around on those shallows, but the technology doesn't start switching on until you get out to these few hundred qubits. So what we're really focused on working is these kind of bridgehead applications, which start turning on at the 100, 200 qubit regime. And this is really when you start to get into the discovery regime. So once you have more than about 50 good qubits, there's no way you're going to be able to classically compute the solution to your problem. But it's not clear you can solve interesting problems. You can just about find some problems that are really, really hard to solve on a classical computer and really, really easy to solve on a quantum computer by design. But then once you get out into the 100, 200 qubit regime, really interesting stuff starts to happen. And that's where we're focused. And to give an idea perhaps of these kind of bridgehead applications, we're really interested in optimization problems on quite a few different areas. There's some very interesting security services areas here. There's some really interesting financial applications. There's some really interesting logistic applications. But these all really start turning on at the 100, 200 qubit devices. So our focus right now as a company is to get there as fast as possible and build these real quality devices, rather than get stuck building small scale applications for kind of peppercorn value. And only do the minimum amount of engagement with end users as is necessary to teach us internally about what we need to do, rather than to act as a service towards other companies.
So are you partnering with some of the companies that focus on, like QCware, focus on the algorithmic side? And then, and because they're sort of agnostic on the hardware side, right? On the production of the qubits and so on, the stable qubits. Are you working with some of those kind of companies on the algorithmic side?
Yeah, we're working with quite a few different companies, both in the kind of quantum software regime, quantum control regime, and quantum tooling regime. Yeah. But I won't say who just yet.
And what would be your forecast then when we get something meaningful? So, a lot of the problems are, some people call them toy problems, or they're not practical. They're just shows the capability, but really there's no practical application to it. It's like Google when they made their first announcement a number of years ago, right? Excuse me. And you've seen another number of announcements, including in China, right, where they're sort of like toy, or not. They're not inconsequential problems, but they're not practical, right? So, what do you see as a roadmap where you have practical timelines of solving something that is meaningful in a way that gives you a real quantum advantage or quantum supremacy in some way? Is it like 2025, or is it just too early or too much in the shallows yet to give that timeline? I'm just following IBM, and they seem to be saying, what, at this date, this is what we're producing, and I know for sure there's a lot of companies trying it, and the optimization, the logistics side, which you mentioned. There's companies in the oil and chemical gas industry, new material people looking at it. I know that financial services definitely is looking at all of this because of portfolio optimization, risk mitigation, and all of the possibilities that are possible. And so, or is that too difficult of a question?
It's a really good question. I think with all these kind of transitions, it's not obvious until you're past the transition. What I'd say is that a lot of this is also dependent on how efficient one is with capital. People think perhaps a lot of money is going into quantum right now, but I think, in the year 2022, about 2%, the amount of investment that went into quantum tech was about 2% of the amount of investment into AI. So compared to growth scale technologies, there's still only a very small amount of capital going in. And what I'd say is what's really important now is we're going through the transition between doing science and research into the development phase. And I think we're now starting to see the first flush of technologies that are proven enough, and the potential is proven enough, that we can see how one can, build, the company, the meta machine that can produce the machine with just cash being injected and much more concrete time horizons. So I think it's very easy to march too closely to the drumbeat of time and set very nice milestones which you can hit that don't really move the needle on useful applications. But I definitely feel that useful applications are going to turn on more like 2025 than 2030. But I won't say too much more, which half year or quarter year it's going to turn into that.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. I did a survey article as a contributor to a business publication, and I interviewed maybe 11 quantum groups, and I would say that they would agree. It's in that time frame, right? Some of the more conservative ones would say maybe post 2030, maybe 2035, but I think everybody agreed that it's happening. It's going to happen, right? And it'll be in niche areas first. It'll be some kind of hybrid system of some sort where you're working between the classical and quantum in some sense. I guess that's the only way you can work anyways, perhaps, right? So, and then there's a sort of universal aspect that will happen towards the end of this time period. But then you get some notable scientists coming up and say this is just all hype, and there was one that came out of the UK, I think, not that long ago, saying this is just all hype and there's nothing, there's no substance to this, or something to that effect, right? And maybe many years out something, but right now this near term possibilities is not happening. I guess, Tom, because you're embedded in it, you're an investable company in this area that you would agree with Chris. It's sort of this near term, right? Rather than 2050. I know that when I was bringing quantum computing to these 100 CEOs in financial services, and I mentioned in 2015, and I said, you know what, you're going to have to start investing now because I see it happening by 2025, 2030. And I remember some people were indicating, no, that's like, it's not going to have us 2100 or something like that. But I would say the bulk of people are saying now it's more the nearer term. Tom, what's your reaction then when you see notable scientists coming out and really opposing this sort of nearer term, quantum computing being proved in a demonstrable way in applications and so on?
And I think it's fantastic. There's a really healthy debate going on, right? And it's good to ask these questions. It keeps us all honest. And, you do see a lot of analogies with machine learning, right? Where there's clearly a lot of hype there. And then there's also some fantastic stuff, which is going to be transformative. And it's, it's hard to pick the things to pieces. I think there's a couple of things which, are really interesting trends in the quantum sector, though. One thing I'd say is that, if you look at where is the bar for doing something that's really, really useful, we've seen two things happen on that front. One is the people that are really thinking about algorithms have shifted from saying, if I have an infinite number of qubits, what can I do with that? To saying, well, actually, if I have a small number of qubits, what can I use with that? And that's kind of happened over the last 5 or 10 years. And that's been totally transformative. And we've seen the kind of thresholds from like, how big does like quantum computing need to be do something useful? It's gone from, 100,000 down to hundreds. And that's, that's really pushed the bar down to where the hardware people like us need to get to. And the other thing is you've seen that the hardware people have gone from being, a 3-person university research lab saying, okay, like, how can I build some device, to saying, okay, like, we're a 50-person company. And if you kind of project the progress forwards based on, where you are as a 3-person team at university and then say, well, how do I extrapolate that? You get an answer which is pretty pessimistic, right? And then when you start saying, okay, if we actually build a company, we do this properly, what does that look like? It's completely different. And I think this kind of angle of the hardware scaling up and the algorithms pushing the bar down means we're really getting quite close to meeting the middle there.
Tom, you spent some time with NIST, right? And NIST has been out, this is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and they've been out, I would say in 2015, calling for papers and then, saying we're going to have to rethink from an encryption standpoint, quantum safe computing and so on. Can you talk about some of that work while you were there working with NIST?
Yes, that was fantastic. That was, when was that? That was quite a while back now. So that was before Ionics. There I was working on a project looking at fundamental science. So the guys at NIST are fantastic. One of the things that they're really world class at, obviously, is standards, called clocks. So, for example, there's a lovely video you can look at from the group that used to be run by Dave Wynand there, where they built a clock that's so accurate that if you lift it up by just 1 foot, you can see it's ticking more slowly because changes in gravity bend space-time over that distance. And that was the kind of project that I was working there. So that was joining a team who were looking at trying to build really, really precise clocks to test whether quantum mechanics is wrong. So a very, very different kind of stuff to the kind of more tech stuff I'm doing at the moment.
Now, both of you were involved in this NQIT program in the UK. Can you talk about that and your experiences with that? And I'll start with Chris and then go back to Tom.
Yeah, so this is the Network Quantum Computing Infrastructure and Technology effort in the UK, which was really the foundation of the UK National Quantum Technology Programme. It's interesting. So the UK was ahead of its time in that the UK National Quantum Technology Programme ended up spurning on lots of other quantum computing programs across Europe and in the US and in Asia. And what they very uniquely did is say, well, there's this technology here that we have world-class effort in the UK. We should have a focused effort that's not just pull together 3 or 4 researchers, but to try and pull together all of the people who are working at the forefront of this field in this, geographical catchment area and fund them well with flexible money over, a long-term 5-year period with the expectation of more coming on. And this really led to quite a few of the technologies that we developed that are now part of Oxford Ionics' core technology today. So this allowed us to really start going outside what can a group of, 5 researchers in a university do with a small amount of money and lots of chewing gum and duct tape, through to what can you do when you start setting ambitious goals and then trying to work out how one can spend money to achieve them and bring in experts as appropriate, both in terms of engineering and in terms of execution across all these different spaces to do it. And we developed a lot of our core technologies there. So we developed the world's best quantum network between 2 quantum computers. So we showed we could take 2 separate quantum computers built on ion traps and connect them together with a fiber optic link. So you can start networking quantum computers together in the same way as you network classical computers together to scale them in large data centers. And that's how you build all supercomputers now. We showed that we could take our qubits, build them into devices and control them with these integrated electronic antennas, and show that in this technology, we could both get single qubit gate errors, so we can manipulate individual qubits with errors comfortably below 1 part per million. So starting to measure the errors as 1 part in 10 to the 7. And we showed we could also increase the coherence times in systems to over 10 minutes. So we weren't just at the point where we could, measure a coherence time and say that the memory disappears in a few hundred, the information disappears in a few hundred microseconds. We could really show we could put these systems into a coherent state, go and have a cup of tea and come back and still measure them in the coherent state. And in the end, in fact, we showed that our qubits were so good that the qubits in our quantum computer were performing as better atomic clocks and keeping better coherence than the atomic clock we are using to reference our electronics to.
Yeah, that's a marvelous
technology out with this focused effort.
So the NQIT program was a really seminal piece of your history in terms of what you're doing today with your Oxford Ionics company, right?
Exactly. I think it caused a flush of spinouts in this space in the UK, of which we are one of them, but also then inspired many other countries, including many delegations from the US who came to see how it was done, which then led to the US quantum program. It led to the European quantum technology flagships, similar efforts in Australia and in China. So it really was, I think, a very seminal piece of work by the UK government, and very timely.
Yeah, I mean, it was really eye-opening. A lot of the academic grants, it's very tentative on the mindset of saying, we'll all say we're going to work together and we write the grant proposal. But when it really kicks off, I'll go and do my pet project, you go and do your pet project. And one of the things was really eye-opening about the NQIT project was that didn't really happen. You suddenly had a lot of people with a very disparate range of backgrounds and skills within the community saying, hey, what are your problems? How can I help you? And you suddenly start to look and say, actually, if we take this and this and put it together, we can do something really special.
I mean, sort of, you are working together. What are the elements that create this marvelous partnership between yourselves, Tom and Chris? And I like to get your individual perspective. So, Chris, your perspective about Tom, and Tom, your perspective about Chris.
Yeah, we've been working together for quite a long time now, over a decade. So I think longer than the average marriage. And I think that was true the last time I looked up the statistics, which was several years ago. So I think it's comfortably longer than the average marriage now. And I think what I really like about working with Tom and what's made our relationship so strong is that we both have very high standards and we both show remorseless ability to pick on other people's ideas. And many of my best bits of work have happened because, I've been saying, oh, it's impossible to do this. It's such a shame. It would be great. And then Tom's, taken the mantle of that to prove it's not impossible by doing it, or to rib me by saying, I'm sure it's possible if you just tried harder. And that kind of relationship of having different backgrounds, different skills, but a shared vision and a shared motivation is incredibly useful.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we have a lot of shared qualities that make us absolute pains in the arse, but have been quite useful, like a shared stubbornness and a shared desire to, one way or other, get to the right answer. And that, ends up becoming like an obsession with feedback and arguing. And, we often find that conversations start with one of us saying something and then the other person saying the opposite very, very passionately. And by the time we've gone through a walk around the fields, we've now somehow accidentally switched roles. We're now arguing the other thing. And by the end of it, you kind of come to a more nuanced perspective. Okay, this is what's right about this, and this is what's right about that, and this is the direction we're going to go in. And that kind of being a lot smarter as a team than you are individually is a really valuable thing in life.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. I think this is incredibly valuable in terms of how we run the company as well. In that, I think it's one of the things I worry about is if we weren't working together as a team on this, is that it's very easy to get set on one aspect of what might be the right solution. And then it's very easy for this to cascade down to the team as a set of orders. And when the team sees us passionately pulling roughly in the same direction, but also, aggressively disagreeing on some of the details, it gives everyone much more permission to say, well, you both agree on this now, but I think you're still wrong, and speak up on these things rather than having one founder who's setting the path in a way that can't easily be questioned. And we definitely try and live the spirit of making sure there's always someone questioning all the decisions and then making sure we've got to the optimal decision rather than just the obvious decision to one of us.
There's always someone calling bullshit.
You have a startup and you have investment and you have Hauser, the founder of ARM, really famous gentleman, as investing in Series A. So there's got to be learnings of being a startup that you just didn't anticipate that surprised you in some way, right? Because you come from academic backgrounds and you've been with research groups, and I'm a startup guy, right? I've done many startups and I'm also an investor. So that mindset's got to be different. So I'd like to see each of your perspectives of what were your learnings in doing a startup, and some good lessons, maybe pro and con.
First of all, what I say is this is an incredibly important part of our identity. The fact that we don't have all the answers, we don't know what the right answer is, and what we're trying to do is produce an environment where everyone can be their best rather than come in with the assumption they know the answer. And I think being able to explicitly be ignorant and have no horse in the fight about what the right idea is very useful there. And definitely, like, one of the phrases we particularly frequently use with our advisors is we want to make the new and exciting mistakes, not the same old boring mistakes that everyone knows about. And we really try and surround ourselves with people who've done enough of this before to know where the obvious minefields are. So we find a new unexplored minefield rather than fall on the same, landmines that everyone else has fallen onto in the long history of each of these different aspects. So definitely one of the things that I most enjoyed about, especially the really early phases of Oxford Ionics, is hiring really awesome people, really exciting people that I'd love to work with and that are much smarter than me from a variety of different backgrounds, and really being able to cultivate a team of exceptionally smart people where you go into the room and realize that you're completely redundant since all the conversation is way above your head and you've got a team of awesome people who are laser focused on the right tasks, and that, our job there is just to bring these people together, set them in the room and make sure they know which direction the prize is and let them get on with it themselves. And I'll let Tom speak on the pros and then perhaps I'll come back to cons.
I think the one of the big lessons I think was also just in terms of getting stuff done, right? You come in as a technical founder, so you have a pretty decent view on like what the tech roadmap looks like, what problems you're solving there, how you're going to build that team. But suddenly, someone's got to do the accounts. So, you start doing that a little bit, you get an accountant, and then, you build the point where you say, okay, actually, this is fun enough, we can now go and get a CFO in, or, the operations, you start running that yourselves until you have a clear enough view of what that team is. I think one of the things that's really challenging and, rewarding about being a startup founder is you're constantly like jumping through new hats and learning new skills. And by the time you've got to the point where you're not totally incompetent at this thing, then it's time to get someone else in to do it on a professional basis. And suddenly you have to go and jump off and figure something else out.
Yeah, and then on to the cons. Definitely for me, one of the cons that we often talk about and we never compensate quite enough for is anticipating just how fast, the growth of these kind of companies are, and getting people in sufficiently far ahead that by the time they're onboarded, we're ready to use that skill is really hard. And whenever we try and, go further ahead and hire people further in advance of when we think we need to build up a new team, we still find ourselves saying we wish we'd hired them 6 months earlier. So then next time we hire them 6 months again earlier than we think. And we still are in this iteration phase of hiring people earlier than we think we need them. And then still by the time they're actually up to speed, realizing we should have hired them even earlier, which is a very interesting psychological challenge.
I think that's true of every startup, right? Every decision is either wrong or 6 months too late. There's nothing else.
Exactly.
one of the things that's uniform among startups is the volatility, right? So it's a constant, you have to be very agile and then so on. Are you experiencing that volatility? I mean, it's very, very common in startups. You know, one day everything is going great, and then something goes wrong, and then the next day everything is going great. So that's sort of very up and down process, and that's pretty much any surviving a startup that I know goes through that process. How do you manage that process?
Definitely, we try very hard to manage the process and to make sure that the team know that the worst possible type of problem is a problem that hasn't been, properly, everyone's not aware of. And, we often say that the problems we're most scared of are the problems we don't know about, and the problems we know about are much, much easier to solve. So, yeah, I think we manage that relatively well at the moment. The really scary stuff, especially at the moment with COVID, in the post-COVID economic hangover, is things like lead times and supplies. So, we're now buying in, for example, equipment on a 12-month lead time. So, our funding cycle is like raising around every 18 months or 24 months. And when you're trying to do that while also juggling, trying to order equipment a year ahead of when you need it, it's crazy. And it's really bending our minds to try and manage this and anticipate growth sufficiently far ahead that we have equipment turning up when we need it, and we don't find ourselves choked by 12-month lead times.
Yeah, I mean, things move really fast at startup, right? And that's part of the fun of it. I think the big advantage you've got as a startup is that it tends to be a lot easier to be quite agile. You have a very clear view of like, this is where we're going, this is the North Star. But actually, the pathway there is not going to be a straight line. And then you're thinking about, not so much any individual decision you need to make or any small change you need, but like how you build a structure which kind of makes those decisions organically without having to have too much like active pushing on the rudder. And that's one thing that's really fun about building these kinds of organizations.
I guess we'll go to now towards the last part of these questions, and this is very open, and you've already discussed this in the first part of our interview. Why are you better than others? And you can go technical too, because I've got quantum scientists in my audience, right? So why is Ionics better?
You've given us a license to go technical, and you can't put that back in the bottle.
Exactly.
What I'd say is the reason our technology on this is better is the same reason we've set the world records before in academia and really set the standard for quantum computing performance. And it's because we have a relentless obsession with solving the right problems in the right order and not cutting corners on the way to scale. So it's very easy to get tempted trying to optimize for the wrong thing in any sort of company, in any sort of technology. You need to be very, very careful what we measure. And what we're really laser focused on is getting to these first useful applications. So in our mind, this can only happen one way. This can only happen when you get out to hundreds of useful qubits, full stop. And there's two ways of getting to hundreds of useful qubits. One way is to build out millions of qubits where you have errors, so they're not useful, and then add an error correction layer on the top of it, which allows you to synthesize a few hundred useful logical qubits. And the other is to reduce the errors down to the point where a few hundred physical qubits can run useful algorithms on a few hundred qubits. So you have a few hundred useful qubits from a few hundred physical qubits. The only way you can get to this second arm, where you just build the stuff you need, is by really engineering, really optimizing your system interfaces, really optimizing how you build out the chips, how you control your physics, how you integrate everything together, how all of the different parts work to eke out the most performance out of all of them. And if you can get into this position, you're then on iterative engineering to increase your system performance massively. If not, you suddenly have to build like 100,000 times more stuff and get it all working. And the cost drivers on lots of that stuff aren't quantum, they're classical. They're things like how many bits of electronics you need per qubit to control it, how big your chips need to be, how many parameters you need to calibrate, what's your calibration overhead. So in our view, the winners in this quantum computing race are going to be the people who can work out how to harness just a few hundred physical qubits to get out to a few hundred useful qubits. And, our bet at the moment is our technology is the right one to get there.
I think maybe one lens you can look at these things is there's sort of there's kind of two types of technology development you can do, right? You can be building a fundamentally new kind of stuff, like, you're inventing some new fabrication process, whatever. Another thing is you can be making something new out of existing types of bits put together in a kind of new and exciting way. And these are both hard things to do. But if you've got one of them, it's usually pretty tractable. Where you tend to find it gets really hard is if you have to do both of these. You have to build a new thing out of new kinds of stuff. And that just becomes really, really difficult. And I think this is where a lot of the challenges that some quantum platforms face, that you've got to invent new kinds of fabrications which can do things which have never been done before. And then once you solve that problem, then you've got to figure out how to integrate this into a totally new kind of system. And that then becomes the complexity and the challenge and the risk there just explode. One of the things that's really nice about the kind of space we operate in is that if you took the most complex device we're looking at fab making and you took them to a fab in the 90s, they'd say, really? Is that what you want to make? I mean, come on, I've got much better capabilities. Don't you want to use some of the fancy toys? And I think when you say that, and you say again, this is quite boring, this is quite boring, this is quite boring, but there's this integration challenge, it kind of becomes something which is much easier to see, okay, that's tractable, and we know how to do this.
And because you've got this process and this framework as well, and you've got stability, that's what you're basically saying, right? You're more stable than other systems that are out there, then you can scale more easily, perhaps, right? So
yeah, that's right. So what we've shown now is that we can take these qubits and we can control them really beautifully, perfectly with chips.
Right.
And what we've also shown is we can take these chips that we can build with our small in-house microfabrication team, and we've now taken these to tier 1 semiconductor foundries. We have a partnership with Infineon, who can take these devices and take them from these bespoke, simple devices that are produced in onesie twosies by, a skilled expert who spent a long time honing their skills in the clean room, and take these to put them onto a semiconductor manufacturing line, a standard semiconductor line, which can make them alongside chips for, on the same machines as chips for cars and cell phones and laptops, and produce them with incredibly high yield. That's starting to get to the magical point where you can start essentially copying and pasting your design to make bigger chips, and broadly be facing small integration details rather than existential problems about how you build out these chips. And it's the fact that the chips are easy to build and the qubits are guaranteed identical and you don't have to manufacture them that allows you to get into this space like you do with semiconductor manufacturing, where nothing's perfect, but you can manage the process variance enough that you don't worry about characterizing the transistors in your CPU. You just know they're guaranteed to be good enough by the fab process that you can just copy paste them out to massive scale. And that's why we're so excited about this technology.
How are you on the entanglement side? In terms of the number of qubits that where you can have entanglement. Where do you see that, or do you see some sort of limitations? A lot of people are running into those kind of problems of getting the entanglement across qubits, right? So
yeah, so this is what we focus on a lot in our devices, how we can get the entanglement to the very highest fidelity possible. And we're now comfortably setting this state-of-the-art in our devices. And we're pushing very hard over the next 6 months to a year to show that in these devices we can produce on a standard semiconductor production line. We can get the errors down to the point where you can run algorithms on hundreds of qubits, and then you just need to do the engineering around this. And what's really important about the ion trap systems over any other system is that you can physically reorder the qubits to make the two qubits you want to talk together talk to each other. In many other technologies, you have a fixed lattice of qubits. So if you want to make qubit 1 talk to qubit 598, they have to talk to each of the nearest qubits, which then means you have to do many, many entangling operations to do this, which builds your error. And this dominating error is why the fact, IBM have these 400 plus qubit devices, but by benchmarks, 10 qubit, 12 qubit ion systems perform a lot better. It's really all about this connectivity and this entanglement fidelity. And with these ion trap devices, where we can do all of this stuff with classical electronics and classical control, and just have the qubits, these individual atoms, as our quantum elements, we can do all of this with really high performance.
I didn't quite catch the foundry that you're working with. Which one was it?
We're working with Infineon in Europe. They're based in Munich.
Right. Have you talked to Taiwan Semiconductor at all, and Philip Wang, who's their chief scientist?
No, we haven't.
I mean, he's a big thinker as well, right? So I think it's worth a conversation. Okay, we're down to our last question. What are your recommendations to the audience? And I'll go to Tom first, and then I'll go to Chris.
Recommendations in what sense do you mean?
It's open field. It could be watch our work. It could be this is what's going to happen. There could be recommendations for people who are entrepreneurs who want to be do startups. It's an open field. What's your final recommendations to the audience?
Oh,
Well, perhaps I'll jump in first, which is quantum computing is coming. I think there's a beautiful analogy to artificial intelligence that I think Tom's already made on this, that it feels like there's any new technology, people talk about it a lot, everyone gets very excited, then there's a lull of disappointment in the middle. And what's happening in that lull of disappointment are people are finding out how hard it really is and tackling those hard problems. And quantum computing is in this phase right now where there's a lot of noise being made about results that have happened in the past. And there's a lot of hard work going on solving these problems and scaling out these challenges. And in the same way as AI went from clearly not working to possibly interesting to we should have invested that a while ago and really built our companies around this new disrupting influence in the market, the same is going to be true in quantum computing. The next couple of years are going to be, there's going to be a lot of noise and a lot of hype coming out from many different directions. But at the same time, there's a lot of stuff building up that's going to disrupt a lot of different business use cases. And if you don't know, how your company is going to be disrupted by quantum computing, you really should make sure you understand how before you place your bets.
Yeah, in fact, and just sort of reaction to your comments, I always tell CEOs, you can't wait. You got to get on and start doing the early work, even though you don't get results, because it's going to take time to incorporate it into your businesses and so on, right? So, and that's why back even in 2015, I was telling the financial services CEOs, you've got to start investing now and playing with it, right? Getting to know it. Because to integrate it and from an adoption standpoint, I would say it would take 3 to 5 years, right? So you got to have that roadway to get involved. The same with AI and machine learning, right? You got to get into it so you can then scale it beyond little niche applications and so on. So
yeah, the best companies who speak to all of these things have teams of 10 to 20 people right now, quantum experts focused on these use cases and applications.
Right.
Because they really, really want to understand this and get the team in place. So when it's time to scale, they can click their fingers and be off to the races, rather than just be waking up when they see their competitors get to the same point.
Yeah, and then startups or companies can literally be bombarded with some new innovation, like what Apple did in 2007 to the phone marketplace, right?
That's right.
Companies literally lose their market position in a year to 2 years. And in fact, that acceleration is even quicker today. So it can't be something where you sit on the sidelines. You've got to get involved, right? Especially if you're a larger company. So Tom, you've had a chance now to think.
Chris has given you Chris has given you the application perspective. I'll give the thing for engineers, right? Which is what I think is great about quantum computing when you're actually in the lab building things is just the range of things you get to do. The reason quantum computing is hard and rewarding is because it's not just an electronics problem. There is important electronics, but that's not the whole thing. It's not just computer science, although that's important. It's not just quantum physics. It's not just mechanical engineering or optical engineering. It's a really interesting intersection of all of these things. And I think that's where you find that some of the most interesting technologies emerge, when you have to be in this set of mindset of being kind of expert generalist in the engineering front, of like understanding enough of electronics and whatever else that you can blur these boundaries together and then find new ways of optimizing across the system. I think that's a fascinating, rewarding area to work in.
Yeah, and then reaction to what you're saying, Tom, it's really the ultimate transdisciplinary area, which then makes it really exciting to work in. So for people who are out there who are engineers or scientists, it's an area that they should start looking at if they're not in it in some way or looking at it more deeply, right? And
I think that's right. I think there's a lot of engineering problems which are hard, but they're very single disciplinary. You've got to build a thing that does this thing really well. I think where a lot of the interesting things come as you say, well, you've got some problem you have to figure out, and you can push some of the pain to this side or this side or this side, and you have to somehow build a team with people that can figure out how to distribute that pain properly, and that becomes a really, really hard problem and really interesting.
Yeah, like any field, when it's taken off and in 10, 20 years' time, there's going to be very well-defined boundaries, very rigid, very understood landscapes that people just have to execute under. But where we are now at this nascent point where the field's really just starting to kick into gear, it's a tremendously exciting time to be part of it.
I agree.
Exactly. So you must wake up every day and be really excited what's going to happen that day, that week, that month, that quarter, for the year and going forward. So I really appreciate you, Chris and Tom, coming in. You're really leading physicists in this area, definitely pioneering researchers in quantum computing. And I would say more broadly, quantum information science and technology. Just marvelous work that you're doing. And of course, you're co-founders of Oxford Ionics. So thank you for sharing your insights, your experiences, your passion, your excitement with our audience.
Well, it's been great chatting with you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.